Hello, I'm your host, Mike Gelb, and this is the Consumer VC podcast where we discuss the intersection of venture capital and consumer innovation. If you're enjoying this show, also subscribe to the newsletter at theconsumervc.substack.com to get episodes straight to your inbox. All content and episodes are for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not investment advice. Before we get into today's episode, I want to tell you about A-Venture, a new platform that's about to launch that's making venture capital available to the masses. It doesn't matter if you're accredited or non-accredited. A-Venture provides an opportunity to diversify your investment portfolio and invest in private funds. If you're a fund manager, the A-Venture app also provides everything you need in order to make startup investments, including extensive research materials, seamless transaction processes, and allocation measures so you can properly diversify your portfolio. Now, typically, venture capital and startup investments are liquid, which is a major pain point for our industry. A-Venture is fixing this by offering periodic withdrawals for its investors. I and many others in this industry are so excited about this launch. They are preparing to list their first fund in the beginning of next year. So if you want to be the first to know, join their waitlist at aventure.vc. Our guest today is Elly Truesdell, founder and managing partner at New Fair Ventures, a venture capital fund centered on the modern eater and evolving American palate. Some of their investments include Made By Nacho, Midday Squares, Foxtrot, and Tacombi. We discuss her time at Whole Foods, how she ended up meeting Bobby Flay and founding Made by Nacho, and why she wanted to start a fund, how she thinks about investing in food and retail. Without further ado, here's Elly. Elly, thank you so much for joining me here on Consumer VC. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me. No, very glad to be here.
Oh, it's a pleasure having you on the show, and I really appreciate you taking the time. So let's start from the beginning. Were you always attracted to nutrition, Whole Foods, and kind of buying products from the natural channels?
I love you phrasing it that way because so often people just ask me, were you always into food? And the answer is yes. But I would say a question that I don't often get is, was it always Whole Foods? Was it always nutrition? And no, definitely not growing up as a kid. I would say I just loved food. I sort of loved everything about it, but I think I sort of ate it all growing up, and I didn't have as much of a focus on sourcing and supply chain and what that could mean for nutrition. So it really did take me working for and with actually a tiny produce startup. And that's not even the word to use. I worked at a produce stand when I graduated from college and really just loved it. Like I enjoyed selling fruits and vegetables. I loved interacting with farmers that we were buying from. And that sort of, I think, motivated me to start reading a little bit more about the food system and agriculture. And it was right around the time that Michael Pollan had written The Omnivore's Dilemma. I was reading his work and just very quickly got immersed in supply chain, agriculture. And then I think sort of through all of that, understood, okay, that actually connects to human health in a big way. And once I identified Whole Foods as my mecca of where I wanted to work, which was the following year, so a year post-college, once I started working for the company, I mean, they, especially at the time, did an amazing job training you in terms of sort of what it meant to adopt a Whole Foods lifestyle, not the brand Whole Foods, but like actually eating whole foods and plants and what that could do for your body. And that really transformed my relationship with food. I became really excited about nutrition and health, and more than anything, plants, and just eating delicious, great food that was sort of close to its source and whole form.
That's awesome. That's also really cool how Whole Foods really helped kind of shape you in terms of thinking about nutrition and what to eat and kind of everything around that. What were some of the learnings, would you say, from Whole Foods? I understand like the learnings from a personal perspective in terms of what you eat, but how about from a understanding like kind of how the food system works and everything around that? What were kind of like your lessons learned? Because I know you're at Whole Foods for a long time and eventually rose to become the global director of local brands and product innovation. But what were kind of like the learnings along the way?
Yeah, I think one thing that's so interesting that I reflected on a lot once I was in and at Whole Foods for a number of years was that the year post-college, even in college and in undergrad, I was studying media. I was interested in food, travel, lifestyle. And then I got a little bit more academically interested. I mentioned that year after graduating from college. And so sort of had this intellectual curiosity and was just reading a ton and taking it all in sort of outside of the industry. Once I started working for Whole Foods and in this really unique position, which I'm sure we'll talk about, as both a forager and then later on overseeing the local and innovation program, I started to develop a really different perspective, which was from within the system itself and watching both a ton of young brands, but also farms, fishermen, livestock, husbandry, farmers, and understand their world a little bit differently than how I was reading about it more academically and in that position that was removed. So I think Whole Foods itself, like the organization and the company, did a great job of immersing people in the mission, the connection to sourcing, the connection to local producers and to organics and why that's so important for environmental and human health. But I think I had a really unique perspective and I was really lucky in my role overseeing local brands to every single day be sort of at the epicenter of this young consumer brand culture, but also very much in the center of sourcing local agricultural product and seeing what farmers went through sort of to get their food to us and what that meant for the supply chain. And so I developed, I think, my interpretation of like what goes into producing food and what's a requirement that is different probably than when you read about it. Obviously, it's like being close enough to it, you recognize why certain people aren't getting an organic certification. You're recognizing why those certifications are really important. You're like, it's just become so much more nuanced once you're inside of an industry and watching people actually operating these businesses, which are really hard to run.
So, as your role as, when you're sourcing and collaborating with these local brands and looking at product innovation, what were maybe some of the product innovation that you were seeing that was pretty mind blowing in your sphere?
Yeah, it's fun to look back. I say this a lot that today, 2022, what was exciting or quote unquote disruptive, I'm saying with air quotes, in food like 15, 12 years ago is table stakes today. So it's actually really interesting to think through what was considered highly innovative. But on the other hand, I think it's really important to remind ourselves that there was a renaissance that was needed in American food. And I was really lucky in the timing of my growth at Whole Foods and in being in that forager role and then in my global position overseeing local from 2008 to 2017, because that really was when the natural organic foods industry had this incredible growth curve that was necessary. Like the big legacy food brands, the big strategics who we all know, had not been disrupted, had not been challenged yet. And so I was it was such an amazing thing to be a part of. And with that, I think something, I use brands such as Sir Kensington's as a great example. Today, their product lineup might not look that innovative, but it really was different to be looking at whole tomatoes, not using high fructose corn syrup, knowing where they were buying those tomatoes, and really like dissecting an ingredient deck. That was innovative. They continuously got better. I worked really closely with the Sir Kensington's team on one of their most interesting products, their Fabonnaise, which is their vegan mayo product, where they identified aquafaba, the byproduct of chickpeas, as a source to an egg replacement or an egg substitute. And they told me about that early days of, oh my gosh, we've just found this amazing protein source to make a vegan mayo. It's called aquafaba. They're sort of educating me on this. But as they were telling me, I thought it was really interesting that there must be any number of hummus producers in the country who are creating a byproduct of aquafaba through their production. So we went out and I got them connected to 6 or 7 hummus producers that sold to Whole Foods. Turns out that only one of them was actually drying and soaking their chickpeas and then cooking them. It was really interesting to learn that a couple people had other processes, which were not nearly as sort of traditional, where they were just reconstituting chickpea flour. And it shows in the quality of the product. I won't name any brands here. But so anyhow, Sir Kensington's ended up partnering with that first hummus producer and buying their aquafaba, or taking what was otherwise their waste, and creating a vegan mayo. So I think that was just one example. But I think categorically, I mean, it's important to sort of like look back and think what was exciting and amazing in those early days. Cold brew was not a category. I mean, green juice came and went during my years. Coconut water, kombucha, I think plant-based yogurt was in its early days. It still maybe even hasn't had its moment. And then I think there were some really interesting where I'm still sort of most excited and feel really proud to be a part of the early days was in some of the indoor controlled ag and these more novel approaches to farming that are far less resource intensive. So, name your indoor farm: Gotham Greens, Bowery, Plenty. They're all doing really interesting things. Smallhold, who's, largely a consumer brand for mushrooms, but who's farming in this tech-enabled way. And that's actually one thing I always really loved and thought was pretty interesting, and is still a thesis that we're looking at, of commodities and commodity categories that have started to operate and utilize the CPG playbook. Smallhold being a great example of, their mushroom business, largely in produce and in mushrooms. It's pretty unbranded and feels like a commodity, but they are growing specialty mushrooms that are delicious, highly differentiated, and they have this amazing consumer brand. I think Bowery Farming has been able to do the same thing. I think Luke's Lobster has been able to do that in lobster and seafood, where you don't see that much. So we're watching different parts of the store start to take on what the middle of the store does very well.
No, and first of all, I really appreciate those examples, and to also say that, things that, were pretty innovative back, 10, 12 years ago. Now it kind of seems like table stakes. And I think that also and I talked about this with Caitlin Smith when I had her on the podcast, founder of Simple Mills, about how also like the consumer has just become a lot more aware too. About ingredient choices and kind of doing their research and really understanding, what types of foods they actually want to eat and not, and really kind of being almost skeptical about brands, becoming, because they want to be very like maniacal about what ingredients they're actually using.
Absolutely. We talk a lot about this at New Fair, just that the consumer today is so much more educated, informed, and just is expecting that much more from their food in terms of both brand and the experience that they're getting from that food. So we take a much sort of more skeptical eye to young consumer brands today, just for that exact reason.
So why did you end up leaving Whole Foods to become the CEO of Canopy Foods?
So at the end of 2017, I'd been almost 10 years at Whole Foods. My pretty much entire career post-college had such an amazing run there. And the acquisition from Amazon had gone through, was formalized. And I'd already been feeling for that year that enough was shifting in terms of the culture and some of the sentiment. And honestly, by necessity, Wall Street was putting a lot of pressure on Whole Foods. Had been so much competition in, let's say, the 3 years prior to the Amazon acquisition that we were all feeling it internally, and the company was making a number of changes. I think I always try to say they were necessary changes, and so think a lot of those things needed to happen, maybe could have happened differently. But for me, it was a really good motivation and push to say, okay, I think now's the time to move on. There was a lot of centralization happening over the course of those years that for me, leaving and being in a position that was overseeing the local program nationally was tough. It was really transforming the way that we could operate. And so that was a driving or motivating factor. But also, I just saw there being a lot of opportunities and other parts of the food system that maybe needed attention. So I mentioned this, like, I feel so lucky that I was in the role that I was, really supporting and driving young consumer brands from 2008 to 2017. But what I saw during that 9-10 year arc was the largest and biggest challenge all of these brands have is their co-packers. Number one issue pretty much across any founder that I would speak with, especially when we were trying to scale them or grow them from a single region to multi-region or to go national with Whole Foods, was my co-packer's a nightmare. I'm probably not going to be able to either, meet that timeline, or they'd bring us a product that looked unrecognizable to their first product when they'd fully commercialized and scaled, and had moved into, a manufacturer of a larger size. They just weren't responding to where the market had gone in terms of product integrity and quote unquote better for you brands. So before I ever used the word thesis, I guess I had a thesis then that upstream we were creating a huge bottleneck. If you've seen this massive proliferation in better brands, higher integrity food products, but they can't scale because they don't have the manufacturing partners to do that with, then there's going to be a huge need for innovation, investment, and attention on the co-packing layer. So I'd already been thinking a lot about that. And I'm sort of a person who always wants to address problems and solutions. And I think a lot of people ask me, why wouldn't you have just gone to a single brand, or why wouldn't you have just started a food company? Like, you're so well equipped to do it after your 10 years at Whole Foods. And it was really, my answer there was, I didn't see there being a major white space or a need. Where I felt like there was a major need was further upstream in supporting and creating the infrastructure to drive the industry forward at scale. So simultaneously, two people I'd worked with prior, founders who were had brands with us at Whole Foods in years prior, had talked to me about this company they were building, Canopy Foods, which was addressing, just that. It was sort of in its ideal state meant to be a strategic co-packer, not only scaling products with integrity and in the way that we felt like the industry needed, but also you've got this suite of services with people on staff who are going to help you with brand strategy, soon enough, omni-channel execution, all the things that you might need in addition to straight manufacturing. So that really attracted me as a business, and decided to make the move over there. I also was lucky to carve out some major flexibility in making that move, so that I could take an advisory role with a fund, which I ended up taking with Almanac, the venture fund that I eventually joined full time. But that was important to me because as I was leaving Whole Foods, I had a ton of opportunity in VC and private equity. And frankly, I didn't even really get it at the time. I wasn't, I was pretty naive to the value I'd created and the inherent deal flow that was my life. And so I was attracted to Canopy for a couple of reasons. I understood and really bought into the purpose and the mission of the company, thought it was an exciting opportunity for me to really learn a different side of the business and a different part of the value chain. And I guess lastly, had some flexibility to join a fund as an advisor and dip my toe in that world to see what it was like.
What was maybe part of the attraction that maybe venture capital, even though you didn't come from a VC background, what kind of interested you there? And what were kind of your first impression, having this advisory role at a fund, and what did you really enjoy about it?
It was really instructive having the time to dip my toe or act as an advisor and learn as I did over those months. Because I really didn't have a sense of where my time would be spent if I were to join a VC. And so I think what I quickly learned that people had been telling me for a long time, but I just didn't see it yet or didn't have the imagination for, was so much of the work that you've been doing at Whole Foods is going to translate and is really applicable to the world of venture. And that immediately became apparent that I could step in, add operational value, offer a lot of strategic support to these consumer brands, and in some cases, marketplaces or technologies that we were invested in, but that I could work really closely with founders and with teams to help them across a variety of points in their business. As I was continuing to get the experience at Canopy, that became really valuable to advise and guide on co-packing management, supply chain, logistics, some of those pieces, and navigating, your relationship with your co-packer. But also for my Whole Foods days, just a lot in terms of brand strategy and positioning, a lot in terms of wholesale distribution and even sales. I mean, that's become a huge piece to where I can be helpful, is hopefully getting you some interest from buyers, but also thinking through channel strategy and how you should navigate that. And then I guess the other big one is in team hiring and recruitment. That's just always been something that I really care about, is staying in touch with a lot of people in the industry. And I sort of joke that I moonlight as a recruiter, because a lot of people come to me when they're looking to either hire for a position or when people are getting ready to leave or move elsewhere. I feel lucky to often be a person people call, and I try to make myself really available for that, because it's become a huge asset. It's probably if there's anything you can do to help your portfolio more, it's help them land an excellent hire. And so I try to do that as much as I can for the portfolio now. And I learned that along the way at Almanac. So I think on the portfolio management and just operating profile, I immediately could plug in, but it was such a nice, I was lucky to have the chance to then learn all of the other pieces of how you structure a fund, how you think about your position, your strategy, your check size, and then what your fund sort of stands for when you combine it all.
No, and I appreciate that. I mean, what I also find really quite interesting is when I guess you get more involved with Almanac and eventually go, full time, become a full time investor, you then also start a brand, Made by Nacho, which I know you said initially when you left Whole Foods, you didn't think there was actually that the real pain point was more on the infrastructure side, not on the brand side. How did you meet Bobby Flay? How did this all happen with Made by Nacho? And what's kind of like the founding story? And why did you think that there was a space within cat food that you thought was worth exploring?
Yes, I never would have predicted that the brand I did start would be in non-human food, especially in cat. So I was also lucky to work over my years at Whole Foods with a ton of chefs. I helped launch the Roberta's frozen pizza line. I worked with the Momofuku team, the Blue Hill team, which is how I ended up landing at Almanac, the venture fund, which is associated or is founded by David Barber of Blue Hill. And so worked with a lot of chefs and was sort of known in the culinary world of, if you're going to look to launch a consumer brand, you need to talk to this woman, Elly, at Whole Foods. So I had that reputation. I met Bobby Flay probably 5 years ago now. It was right around the time I was leaving Whole Foods. He'd heard of me. We just knew a lot of the same people. And as we got to know each other, he's sort of like, listen, if I'm going to do anything in consumer, you're going to be my first phone call. And in my mind, you sort of think about him, his reputation. You're like, all right, he's going to call me about a barbecue sauce or a spice rub, and I'm not going to be that interested. And that's that. But a few, months later, this is a few months after me leaving Whole Foods, he called me about this idea he had with his cat. I'll say Bobby going forward. Bobby Flay, Chef Bobby Flay is a huge cat lover, always has been. And he has an amazing cat named Nacho Flay, who is a massive orange Maine Coon. He's beautiful. He has this really amazing authoritative presence, and he has 250,000 followers on Instagram. He's his own little pet celebrity. So Bobby is getting all these phone calls from big pet food companies offering him licensing and endorsement deals for Nacho specifically, not for Bobby, but for Nacho. And he is sort of like, you know what, I'm not going to do any of this. If I do anything with Nacho, I really want to build it. And I think at the same time, he was sort of recognizing that he didn't he feeds people for a living every day. He has for 30 years, and he still wasn't totally clear on what he should be feeding Nacho, and felt like he needed to do a little bit of research of what the brand was that he was feeding him. Should he feel confident in it in the first place? And I think quickly learned that, number one, cats are obligate carnivores. Like, all they really need is meat. Meat is the number one and should be the number one thing in their diets. And then second is that cats have a lot of trouble with hydration. Your vet almost always is going to tell you, are you getting them enough water? Are you sort of tricking them or manipulating them to make sure that they're getting the hydration they need? Because cats are tough. They often won't just drink water. So he knew those two things were important. And he'd been cooking a lot for Nacho and for his other cat, Stella, who's a bit younger, and recognized there were a lot of tricks that he'd been using in the kitchen that could be interesting if he were to develop a product. So he asks me about this and whether I thought it was interesting. And as I started looking into pet, I was very aware of the fact that a lot of the human food trends and a lot of the movement that we had helped seed and accelerate in natural organic food at Whole Foods over my years was starting to enter the pet arena. That was obvious and clear. But what I also noticed is that was largely devoted to dog. And then once I started researching it, it was amazing to me to learn some of the stats to back that up, that for every dollar invested in pet, 95 cents goes to dog. So that 5 cents isn't even just for cat, it's for all other pet categories. So clearly you're seeing an imbalance. And the other thing that I quickly learned is that the reason so few people go into cat is that cats are notoriously finicky. They are quote unquote picky eaters. And so it's hard to get cat parents to switch, which is why a lot of the legacy brands have been so successful, because they put a ton of palatants in the food, which unfortunately is really bad for your cat. It's the equivalent to junk food for your pet. But they've commanded all of the market share. And so all of those things together made me really interested in the prospect, along with, okay, now you've got Nacho's 250,000 Instagram following, let alone his other channels. And you've got Bobby's platform. Like, this is a really interesting way to launch a company where we already have 250,000 avid, interested customers. And we can use Bobby's platform to elevate that. And so it just became a really exciting proposition. There needed to be a better cat food that was meeting a lot of sort of the things that I care about when it comes to supply chain integrity, sourcing, ingredient standards. And there was a huge opportunity to build a really fun, modern brand with Nacho as our figurehead CEO, founder, face.
That's awesome. That's really cool. I really appreciate also the reasons why there hasn't been too many disruptive cat food brands, and especially interesting. It makes sense how 95 cents on a dollar goes to dogs. I mean, I have a dog, and every time I go to the pet store, I kind of feel that 95 cents, if you know what I mean, because it's so dog oriented. What I also thought was kind of fascinating, I did do a panel. I hosted a panel all about with 3 investors that invest in pet food. And one investor said that the reason why, I think he's a backer of a dog food company, and the reason why that he and many of the other kind of VCs that he talked to don't really look at cat food is just because it's the amount of that cats eat is so much smaller in terms of dogs. So obviously cats are smaller animals, and so your kind of size in terms of what you can it's just a lot smaller than dogs, which I think that's actually a really interesting position for Made by Nacho, because then there might not be many more VCs backing maybe competitors or what have you.
And it's so interesting, because to me that continues to make it that much more compelling. Of so many people are sort of taking that angle of how there's a smaller market there, and it leaves a wide open opportunity that we're really excited to be, sort of carving out our stake, and that we've had some really nice early growth, I think, because of that, because so few people have taken on the challenge.
Now you have Made by Nacho with Bobby Flay. What actually then had you and kind of convinced you to actually go on your own? I know it was a couple of years later, but kind of go on your own and start New Fair. And what was kind of that journey been like so far?
Yeah, I think so much of it has been partially driven by Made by Nacho and building that to this point of early success with Hallie, my co-founder, who I should certainly mention has been such a huge and critical piece to the story, joined me at Canopy Foods, and the two of us have been working together ever since, which is now almost 5 years. And so I think as I had the experience at Canopy building a layer of sort of just operational muscle and understanding of that piece of the value chain, then having the chance to be at Almanac for a few years and being really close to what it looked like to run a fund and to add value to our portfolio, layering in the Made by Nacho work and really being close to an omni-channel brand. I should have mentioned this as well. Another thing that really attracted me to Made by Nacho and co-founding the company with Bobby was having the chance to learn a D2C first business firsthand. I'd not had that experience before. And so much of my career is just sort of seeing something that I haven't had the chance to do before and going after it and learning and then using that the next time around. And so that was a huge piece to starting Made by Nacho and it from day one being an omni-channel business. We launched D2C April 2021, and 2 weeks after in an exclusive national rollout with PetSmart in 1,400 doors in the US. And so that's been really critical sort of for my understanding of omni-channel businesses, but pretty quickly felt like, okay, I have a better handle now on the digital and e-com side of these consumer brands, feel really proud of what we've done at Made by Nacho, and have a really unique perspective on food and food investing that I want to bring and build out independently. And so as I started to sort of feel that, and was very lucky to have the support of my last GP of David to go out and do this independently, I think I wanted to make sure that we were building a fund that was really, really devoted to being hands-on value add. And like, that's the only way we would want to do it. So I think there's a huge shift going on in early stage investing, which is many founders relying on either former founders who are investing now or former operators, and largely not interested in the generalist ivory tower hands-off checks. There's just sort of been a bit of a transition there. And I feel lucky and think that we really represent that type of investor who's coming in, who's had a ton of operational experience, has had a really, really unique 10 years at the center of Whole Foods, seeding and accelerating a lot of these young brands and hopefully contributing to their success, where you've got that now on your cap table. So all of those pieces combined, plus having a pretty clear vision on where I think food and the food system is headed in the future, just made me feel like it was the time to go after New Fair and raise a fund, and was lucky to have a lot of people encouraging that and some early investors, including Bobby and others, who were encouraging of me going out on my own and building this independently.
Do you also find, and I appreciate you talking about kind of the shift in terms of the entrepreneur's mindset of, hey, we actually want maybe more of a strategic investor, strategic meaning they can add value, not strategic as in we work for Mondelez or like a corporate, a corporation. Not that like that, obviously that's valuable in its own right, but strategic as in someone that has kind of operational experience, period, within food and bev. Are you also finding that versus a generalist? Are you also finding that they're now, especially with CPG founders that are there looking for investors that maybe are a bit more retail focused and centric and maybe understand retail as opposed to only understanding e-commerce and D2C?
Yes, I think tackling the first part of the question, it's really interesting to think about what I believe was a little bit of a few years ago movement in corporate VCs, quickly standing up an approach and a strategy and investing in companies. And obviously lots of those still remain and are around and are investing. But I think there's now been enough track record there for young brands to know that doesn't always mean I end up getting acquired. Often it means it may muddy the waters for a future acquisition if I'm not really careful about the terms. And I think in a lot of cases, they're just not able to be nearly as strategic or value add or operational as they wish that they could be. And that's just a function of size. If you're a massive multi-billion dollar company who manages, brands globally, it's really hard to plug into a sub $5 million ARR business and do anything, right? So there's been a little bit of maybe a transition in how founders and young businesses think about strategic VCs and whether they engage with them. And that's put us in a great position of, I hope and think that by reputation and by how much value we've been able to add, both through the Almanac portfolio, but from the 10 years at Whole Foods and the number of brands and founders I touched, and now in having almost a year of our new fair portfolio and what we've been able to do there, that has really helped just make a case for why you'd want to bring someone like us on. And I think food is pretty specific in that as well. Of it's really, really helpful to have people who are empathetic and understand this business and how hard it is, and get that there are shelf life and perishability considerations that other businesses don't go through. And then in terms of, wholesale retail, I think that's a really astute, something I don't actually mention enough. People are coming back and recognizing true omnichannel businesses are critical, and we only invest in brands and companies that are omnichannel. In fact, I heard someone say once that we're going to all look back at this moment in time when we were saying omnichannel so much and think it was like the period when they were saying the color TV, that it just in the future, like we won't, it will just be everything. It will be multi-channel is the way that we do business. And so we're very bullish on that. But I think that we've been able to hopefully already really have a track record in how much we can do to accelerate brands and businesses in a way that puts us in a good position.
I've heard from a few investors who, maybe have a similar focus to yours, investing in food products around, the better for you space, name the category, and that if it's better for you, maybe there's some attraction to invest in it. But what kind of the sweet spot is finding products that can definitely serve the natural channels, but also can also serve the conventional channels, the Walmarts, the Targets, the Krogers, and I wonder. I know you come from the natural, obviously the natural space at Whole Foods. How do you also think about channel selection when it comes to conventional? I know there's conventional now changed quite dramatically over the past few years. There's retailers, the conventional retailers are a lot more open to bringing in natural products. Just how do you think about the conventional channel, about how it's changed, and when it actually might make sense for a brand to enter it?
I think it's changed significantly, and it makes me really proud of what we did at Whole Foods over those years. I think that there was such an amazing infrastructure and platform that we built in the local program, and largely the regional and global interaction that Whole Foods was able to create, driven by people like Errol Schweitzer and others on the global team, and then in regions by various foragers and lots of different people. But I think that what excites me is that where there is the most growth in natural and organic for CPG brands is in conventional and in mass now. And what's exciting to me there is that that was the whole point, right? Like the hope is to get more people eating foods and buying from brands that are offering them better options and sort of like that are going to be more nutritious and more healthful to replace what they were eating before. And so I get really excited when I think about that. I also think that a lot of conventional retailers have done a really good job of stepping in and playing that role and doubling down on their interest in natural and organic. I say that primarily, I mean, the biggest example of that, and the retailer doing it probably the best right now, is Walmart. I hear that from so many different brands that they are getting such commitments from Walmart buyers in order to both, I think they recognize that premiumization in food is very much happening, that this younger consumer, Gen Z and millennials, spend more money on food than any other generation in history. They care a ton about what they're putting in their bodies, which we talked about earlier. And so I think Walmart's done a great job of going after the young, exciting brands and not just with sort of empty promises. They are upholding that relationship and continuing to give them great shelf space and sort of subsidize them to a certain degree to make it work. Other conventional grocers, I think, are attempting that, but maybe haven't quite gotten it right. The one thing that is often overlooked at how the program at Whole Foods was so effective is that we had really unique payment terms, insurance requirements, what we would offer in terms of shelf space and demo, and different marketing opportunities to young, emerging local brands that if you just try to sort of like turn on, we now care about local at a big box retailer, that just doesn't work. So it was the programs that we built at Whole Foods were really thoughtful. They were very specific. But I have been impressed by a lot of conventional retailers. And I think if you, more than anything for brands, if you can identify and strike a relationship with a buyer who you can tell is totally committed to and hopefully has the support of some larger leadership and people around them, because it does get you in trouble if it's just with one individual buyer that you have a relationship. But if you get the sense that a retailer is doubling down on your offering and is really committed to what I expect would be a sort of better for you brand in the category, then take advantage of that. And you know, that will only lead to further growth and what, as I said early on, is exciting is like getting yourself in more American households.
I really like that thought. What I think also needs to be mentioned is like it's so hard to just get into a retailer as a brand. Just getting kind of the buyer on board and kind of everyone on board to actually get to give you shelf space. How should brands approach? Since I know you came from obviously working at one of the premier retailers. How should a brand approach getting into a retailer, and also thinking about which the right retailer should be for their brand?
It's a big question. I think I always recommend to brands or teams or founders that they should make their ideal go-to-market, their ideal list of retail partners that they want to go after. And make sure you know who's really at the bottom of that list. And if that at the very, very bottom, you've got interest or someone reaching out to you, questioning, is that still the right retail outlet for you? So meaning just like, don't jump at any buyer who's interested in your product. I had this conversation a lot with our portfolio and other brands seeking advice of, should we jump at this particular C-store or club program that wants us, even if it doesn't really like squarely fit in our customer profile, and we're going to be at 50%, SRP of where we are with our natural. Like, you've got to consider all of these things. So trying to come out with a proactive plan, being nimble and flexible in that. Like, listen, if your number 3 retailer is really excited about you, that's great. But if your number 10 is who you launch with, that could just be that may not be setting you up well for success. So I think there's a lot of different things to consider. And then in terms of just getting a buyer excited, it's so hard. I mean, obviously, if you can get a warm welcome, that's something. But more than anything, and this is hard to manufacture or fabricate, but you need the buyer to feel like it's their discovery.
They're like part of the journey with you.
Yes, like if you're just, and this is the same with fundraising. I mean, I joke about this all the time. It's just human nature. Like if people think that I'm not asking them to invest in something and they find out about it otherwise, and I haven't asked them, it's like, oh, well, why aren't I getting in on this? And similarly, it's if a brand can somehow make themselves known, which is why I think a lot of digital only brands for a while had such appeal from wholesale buyers. It's like, what do you mean you don't want to be on shelf at Whole Foods and you're only strictly D2C? That there's something in terms of that scarcity that's of course very motivating. It can't always work with a buyer. How do you do that? But on the other hand, if you can meet them in a trade show, if you can meet them in sort of a more unique environment where you get to connect with them, to pitch them your story, have them feel especially grounded in your narrative and hopefully what's a really exciting founder journey and reason for being, then that's going to get them excited.
No, I love that. I love that. I mean, just these are great tips in terms of actually trying to get into a retail store or into a few different retails. How do you think at New Fair, you said something I think really interesting earlier about, what kind of causes a trend to have its moment, right? Or what are kind of like the maybe early inklings. How do you think overall about when you like interviewing like seeing a company? Because of course you're investing, at the very early stages. How do you think about what has to go right in order for this to succeed in kind of the category as well? Like what kind of causes that trend to kind of have a moment?
I get this question a lot, and it's hard to answer because it is so many different things. I think especially in food. In many ways, food is a little bit lower barrier to entry, right? It's easier to develop a food product than it is a tech product or even maybe an apparel product at scale. So there is an element of that puts the pressure on so many other parts to the business. And it means that the product needs to be absolutely exceptional so that a consumer has a reason or a motivation to buy it outside of just making it or recreating it at home. But in terms of what can become sort of a trend or just move in that direction, it's so much of it. I think I have a hard time answering the question because it's, for me, like the number of reps. I see so many different brands, types of food, different food products, and I have now for 15 years, that it allows me to have a better immediate reaction of, is this something that is highly exceptional, can sort of rise above the noise. And I think it's just so many elements. It's then understanding the team, the founder, their relationships with their co-packer and the manufacturer. Is there a raw material or a supply chain component that's going to be really unique and exceptional? So probably less of a specific answer there, but it's so many different pieces. And then there are just certain levels. Like right now, I'm generally excited about upcycled ingredients and closed loop circular economy, utilizing waste. That's a general movement. And then we're going to really have to identify, is there actually a brand that can win there? Is it more upstream and that they're going to be a really interesting moment for manufacturers who are able to do that particularly well? And you start to think about those different components.
I appreciate that because I was about to ask you what are maybe some trends that you're or movements that maybe you're bullish on or kind of pay attention to that you still think are quite small that maybe hasn't had a moment. So I think you've also just nailed down a couple there, but if there's others too, feel free to share.
Sure, that is a big one. We are looking a lot at upcycled ingredients and waste streams. But as I mentioned, I think there's a question of whether we'll be most excited about a brand or maybe more the infrastructure that's fueling that. Because the hope and my prediction is that upcycled ingredients is going to become table stakes and hopefully will be in every private label product and will be ubiquitous across brands, not just a single brand that's using. So that's pretty interesting. We're really bullish on global flavors and founder-driven brands that are utilizing, really unique international flavor profiles to build product portfolios. That's three of the investments we've made to date have represented that. And I think just a stat I use a lot is that in 1970, 90% of the US was white, and today we're 42% racially diverse, which is so exciting on just a general palate level. We've become, by consequence, we have become collectively that much more interesting in terms of our palate and how America eats in terms of flavors and willingness to try new things. And so we are very, very excited about those businesses continuing to thrive and think there's a lot of room. And then I think, a lot of what we think about is fresh snacking and sort of new formats and people eating more in short form and on the go, whether we like it or not, but how we can hopefully invest in those products that are still really good for and offer sort of like the nutrition you want on the go and in a unique format.
No, I appreciate that. I mean, also, like, I know one of the value adds, or maybe part of your aha moment in food in terms of where like a need was having a great relationship with your co-packer and being able to scale. How do you also think about when a brand should vertically integrate versus working with a co-packer? Because I know, for example, you're in Midday Squares, had them on the show. They're completely vertically integrated, as I understand it. And also, how do you think about the value you can add, where it seemed like part of maybe the original thesis was we're really good at finding a great co-packer for you, or kind of understanding maybe that layer of infrastructure a bit better. How do you think about that as it relates to New Fair?
It's very specific to the business. That example is a great one of Midday Squares because that really attracted us to invest in the company, because we knew, okay, you've gone to 24, 26 co-packers. None of them can recreate this product the way that you want it. We loved that. That's a question of quality and integrity that they weren't going to find anywhere else, so they built it themselves. So that was really attractive. I think we also, though, we go pretty, our portfolio is broad in that we're also invested in a company called Arc Foods, which when you talk about vertical integration, they're all the way down to everything but the farmland. So they own the seeds, they contract specifically with farmers, they buy that offtake from them every year, and they resell both on sort of the straight produce side of things. They sell shishito peppers and honey nut squash and heirloom cherry tomatoes, and they also do value-added products that they sell as ready-to-heat and ready-to-eat meals. And so that's even, sort of more intense on the vertical integration side, but that's their business. They have agricultural background, that was their family business prior. And so I think that gave us comfort there. And then there are a couple businesses in the portfolio who rely on co-packers, and that feels more appropriate to how they're building their business. Another brand that I love that I think their product quality is exceptional is Actual Veggies. They make frozen veggie burgers that are whole foods and very much actual veggies, just as the name says. And they've done a great job building out the right relationship with their co-packers to hopefully have a little bit of a moat there. But that's always a question of like, can someone recreate this? So it is dependent on the team, the product profile, and then how that sets them up for success.
I also really appreciate that. But in terms of analyzing, all right, we're not just going to invest in brands that maybe have co-packers, but also like, where does it actually make sense to vertically integrate and when it doesn't? Elly, this has been such a super conversation. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. No, this is so fun. Thanks for having me, Mike.
And there you have it. It was such a pleasure chatting with Elly. I hope you all enjoyed listening. If you also love this content and learning more about consumer startups and VC, subscribe to the newsletter at theconsumervc.substack.com, also available in show notes. Thanks for listening.